And
Hmm.
usually the people that are doing it don't even realize they're doing it, and they don't report any kind of feelings of distress when they do it. So this one is fascinating because this is a coping mechanism for trauma.
Hello, Amanda. So great to be with you again. And we've got an interesting topic today.
Yeah, this is going to be a tough one, I think, for both of us. We've both experienced a lot in this area. We both know other people who've experienced a lot in this area. And there's a lot more to it than I ever realized.
Mm, mm. Yeah, so our topic today, and it's quite a big topic, and I'm sure many people who are listening to this episode have come across this before. So it's about eating disorders and trauma. And one of the things that I found while I was doing my research for this episode was that a lot of studies show that people who have experienced trauma are more likely to go on to engage in disordered eating patterns. And the main ones that I have got here, and I know you've got more information about it in a moment, but the main eating disorders that people are familiar with are bulimia, anorexia, and binge eating. And what studies have found basically is that the earlier the trauma, the more intense the outcome in terms of the eating disorder. So that's quite scary. So it's important, I suppose, for us to be aware that um, people who are experiencing eating disorders, it's not just something that's come out of the blue. It's something that is quite serious and has impacted them for a long time. If they're, really intensely experiencing those symptoms. And what happens is that when someone experiences trauma, their brain grows and develops and is organized in a slightly different way to other, neurotypical people who haven't experienced trauma. So an eating disorder is not just about the food, but it's about control. And if we think back to trauma, what happens to us when we're experiencing trauma is that we are out of control. So basically, a person who is restricting or controlling their eating in some way is actually trying to control things that they can because the trauma was something that they couldn't control.
Absolutely. And back on episode 11 is actually when we talked about the need for control previously on the podcast. So if people are looking for that, that aired on July 11th here in the US, July 12th, there in Australia.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of information there about having that need for control.
Mm.
And there's a couple of different types of food or of eating types that I learned about too. Before we even get into all of the different kind of eating disorders that I've learned about, the eating types, this fascinated me. So the four types of eating are fuel, fun, fog, and storm.
Mm.
So if we break those down, fun eating, well, fuel eating first is where you're eating all the healthy stuff that your body needs. This is your clean eating. You're eating real, whole, natural, minimally processed foods. These are the things that are giving you energy and nourishment to make you feel good. And that's what you want to do 80% of the time. Now, fun eating is when you're eating foods that you love, like ice cream, uh, and they don't necessarily give you anything back except calories. Um, so foods that taste great and you enjoy, but you don't have any real nutritional value. Cake, wine, potato chips, candy, my favorite warm cookie dough. So, and fun foods aren't really that bad as long as you're doing them in moderation. But the rule is that you have to make sure that if you are eating fun foods, you have to enjoy every bite. If you're not enjoying every single bite, like it's the greatest thing you've eaten all day long, then you've already had enough of your fun foods and it's okay to move on beyond those now.
Yeah, I have found myself just literally putting one piece of chocolate in my mouth after another. And before I know it, there's a whole major, big, mega block of chocolate that's gone.
Right. And you don't enjoy every single bite like it's the greatest
No,
thing that way.
No.
So, yeah. So when you find yourself doing that, you have to stop. You have to
Yeah.
stop. You have to get up. You have to go put it away, put it in the fridge, put it in the cupboard, whatever it takes. So fog eating is really interesting because that's going to be more where you were just talking about with the chocolates. So
Mm.
you're munching on chips, you're not tasting them anymore. You're snacking on peanut butter and jelly, you're not tasting it anymore. You're doing this while you're doing something else. You're not focusing on what you're doing. You don't remember what you ate. You don't remember what it tasted like. So, fog eating is not at all enjoyable. It's not at all purposeful. It's an
Yeah.
unconscious munch that you're doing. So, the goal is to never fog eat. If you catch yourself doing it, stop doing it immediately, recognize that you're doing it, and correct your own behavior.
Mm-hmm.
And this is where some of these eating disorders are going to fall in. But then a lot of them, most of them, fall under storm eating. And
Yeah.
storm eating is binge eating or eating out of control. It's when you cannot stop yourself from eating. You know that you're doing it, you want to stop doing it, but you feel like you can't stop it. You have no control over it at all. It controls you. And that gets really scary. It's
Mm.
almost like you're watching another person do this. You're sitting outside of your body and you're watching somebody else eat all this food for you.
Yeah.
You're just lost. And you can actually experience some of these all at the same time. Specifically, fog eating and storm eating often coexist.
Mm. So with these types of, because I've not come across this before, it's really interesting. With these types of eating, is that like, for everybody, we all go through those examples?
We do. I'm sure there's probably other examples out there, but these are the four main types of eating that we do. I
Mm.
mean, I can probably narrow down every meal that I've had this past week into at least one of these um, uh, funnels.
Yes.
So mostly fuel eating. I've done pretty well this week. Um, Last night I had some fun eating. I had a Bavarian pretzel at my book signing. That was lovely, but I shared it with my husband, so I didn't overeat on it. I do occasionally fog eat. So if I'm eating lunch while doing something else and not paying attention to what I'm doing, a lot of us do this while we're working. If you work through your lunch break and you're sitting there munching on whatever it is that you've got for lunch while you're working, this is fog eating. This is doing nothing for you mentally. You're not getting any kind of physical break from what you're doing. You're just plowing on through. What's the fun in that?
There isn't. And I think that, just as a little tip regarding, mindfulness that we've talked about before in lots of episodes, um, actually taking your break at lunchtime, whether it's at work or at home or wherever, it's important to actually just sit quietly and enjoy the food because it's actually being digested better. So, in
Yeah.
terms of your own physical digestion, taking time and enjoying the food is so important. As we know that I come from a Greek cultural background, and food to us, when we sit down and we eat and we enjoy it, we laugh and have a great time. And that for me has been a really good experience growing up because it allowed me to really focus on enjoying my food
Yeah.
and doing the fun and fuel at the same time.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that. I love that. Because let's be honest, not every food is going to be completely whole and nutritious, and it's not all going to be that perfect food that fits under the fuel. You
Mm,
can have chicken and mashed potatoes, and you've got butter and milk in those mashed potatoes, and that's probably not going to be the healthiest thing. But when you load it up with the gravy, that becomes fun food. And it's important to
exactly.
recognize that you are eating the fun food and it's okay to have that fun food. So,
Indeed.
and there's
Indeed.
one of the eating disorders that I'll get into towards the bottom of my list here actually talks about why that's important.
Well, how about we move into the different types of or different examples of eating disorders, because I mentioned bulimia, anorexia, and binge eating earlier.
Right.
What are the different types that you have explored and found out about?
So of course, those three are the most well known.
Mm,
But for people who don't know, anorexia is considered to be the most deadly of all mental illnesses. I
mm,
didn't know that until just recently. And that's
mm.
because it has the highest mortality rate of any mental illness.
Yeah.
So that's more than just food restriction, too. Whereas a lot of people believe that anorexia is just where you stop eating completely. It's more than just food restriction, but sometimes it includes extreme behaviors and exercising a lot and
Yeah.
avoidance of people, avoidance of going out with friends because you don't want them to pressure you into eating. And it
Mm.
has this trickle effect.
Well, if you
Bulimia.
like, I can, sorry, I was just going to say, while we were talking about anorexia, I could maybe just add in a little bit about some of the effects that anorexia has on the
Oh,
body that
yeah.
leads to mortality.
Yeah.
Um, so things like, drastic weight loss, it breaks down the muscle mass in your body, and it actually siphoning out nutrients out of the bones. Um, it redirects energy or nutrients from the processes that fuel the brain, the heart, and the lungs. So, those really major important organs are not being fed, not being given the nutrition that they need. And again, through that anorexic eating, there's the negative effect of cascading hormones on the body, organs, and all those internal functions. So those things, unfortunately, lead to thinning bones, heart disease, and neurological issues like fainting and seizures and muscle weakness. So if you're starving your body, you're actually slowly killing yourself.
Yeah. Yep. Absolutely.
And that's the scary thing about it.
Yeah. And a lot of those same things are going to come up with bulimia nervosa
Yeah,
also.
yeah.
So, and that's more than just binging large amounts of food and then purging it also. Just like anorexia, it can include overexercising,
Mm-hmm.
including diet pills.
Mm-hmm.
It can include the dangerous use of large amounts of laxatives.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. And those can lead to some really dangerous behaviors too. Eventually, a lot of people with bulimia move back and forth between bulimia and anorexia.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And it actually does some pretty serious damage to our digestive system. Like through the purging, for example, that actually impacts on our intestinal system, particularly, and it also leads to irritable bowel syndrome. So not only is the person dealing with disordered eating, but then they've got these sort of knock-on effects with all the other impacts on the body.
Right.
It's quite scary stuff.
Yeah. And it can cause all kinds of severe burning of the throat.
Mm-hmm.
I had a friend with bulimia who had to have surgery to have some of the tubes in her throat removed and replaced because she
Yeah,
wasn't able to swallow anymore.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, one of my daughter's friends has ended up in like constantly hospitalized, and she's having operations every 6 weeks to change tubes that are attached to her, and that's going to be a lifelong thing for her.
Oh,
Every 6 weeks going through major surgery. So it's scary stuff. It's
that's
really scary
awful.
stuff. Mm.
So I've got a couple of eating disorders here that are very close to bulimia and they're kind of related in a way. One of
Hmm.
them sounds really funny. It's called drunkorexia.
Hmm.
And it sounds like a joke, but this is actually a term that describes an eating disorder accompanied by alcoholism. So I've
Wow.
known people with this one, and I didn't know it had a name, but people with drunkorexia restrict foods and they purge to be able to save the calories for later so that they can drink their alcohol and have their calorie intake come from that.
Wow.
So, and this can actually cause some pretty serious malnutrition and extra strain on the internal organs, especially
Yeah.
the liver.
Yeah.
Um, There's also something called pregorexia, where pregnant women are so terrified of gaining weight or having the baby bump show that they restrict themselves so much during pregnancy that it's dangerous to themselves and the baby.
Of course. Of
Yeah.
course. That's horrific.
Yeah. It can cause low birth weight. It can also cause, for the mom, coronary heart disease, type 2 diabetes, stroke,
Mm,
hypertension, cardiovascular disease, depression, all kinds of stuff. So,
yeah.
mamas, if you're pregnant, it's okay to eat. Please go grab something and eat.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Orthorexia nervosa is a relatively new term for someone who is under so much pressure to eat healthier. Remember, we were talking about eating healthy all the time.
Yes.
They're under so much pressure to eat healthier that it causes them to obsessively plan a perfect diet and it starts to interrupt their lives.
Mm, mm.
So, and then
So
I got
you can
into,
see the control there, can't you?
right, absolutely. You're
Yeah.
obsessing over making sure that everything is perfect.
Mm,
There is no perfection. It's okay to let it go. So, and of course, binge eating, it's also known as BED in psychological circles. But binge eating is, of course, when somebody typically will binge on large amounts of food, usually within 2 hours. So, this is interesting because I always thought that binge eating was just somebody who overate. I didn't realize that it was restricted to somebody who would usually overeat within 2 hours. So, bingers are then usually accompanied by trance like states, feelings of guilt and shame, and of course, the weight gain. But
mm,
the difference between binge eating disorder and bulimia, of course, is the purge factor.
mm,
So
mm.
people with BED don't purge, and they're usually overweight. So they feel completely out of control when they're eating and will frequently eat when they're not hungry at all.
Mhm.
So, what I have and what I struggle with is compulsive overeating. It's very similar, but with compulsive overeating, people don't binge in spurts, but rather eat large amounts of food pretty much all day long. It's classified under an unofficial eating disorder diagnosis, but it
Right.
is an eating disorder. So whenever I have breakfast, I tend to overeat because I have this mental thing in my head of not knowing when my next meal is going to come because I've had
Mhm.
to live so much of my life like that. This is absolutely a trauma reaction in my case.
Mm, mm,
So, Prader-Willi syndrome, this one's really interesting, can lead to compulsive eating and obesity, but is typically caused by an inherited genetic disease that begins with weak muscles, poor feeding, and slow development in babies. And it can later cause an insatiable hunger. And kids with Prader-Willi syndrome will often get diabetes. So this one is not necessarily caused by trauma, but it does exist. And if you notice these symptoms in your kids, you need to get
mm.
them seen, see if they need to be diagnosed because this is something that is treatable.
Yeah. Yeah.
Have you heard of pica?
No,
Oh,
you've actually thrown a lot at me today that I haven't come across before.
it threw a lot at me that I hadn't come across before too, just doing the research on this. So I have known about pica. I've known about it for a while. My best friend's little girl has it. So, pica is an eating disorder where a person craves things that are not actually food.
Mm,
So, something like dirt, chalk, paper, cardboard, clay, a lot of times hair. And it's considered to be a disorder when this continued uh, uh, eating and feeding of non nutritive substances lasts for a month or more.
wow.
So,
I have
apparently,
actually heard of things like that before, but I didn't know that's what it was called. Mm,
yeah, it's really interesting. It's PICA. Yeah. So pica. um, there's one called rumination disorder. That's where a
mhm,
person brings up previously swallowed foods and chews them repeatedly. So they're regurgitating in their mouth. I know I didn't go into too much detail on this one. It's a lot more common in young children of early school age, but it can often continue into adulthood. And
mhm.
usually the people that are doing it don't even realize they're doing it and they don't report any kind of feelings of distress when they do it. So this one is fascinating because this is a coping mechanism for trauma. This is also something my father has done my entire
Mm.
life.
Wow.
Yeah. Yeah. When I learned about that one, it's like, oh, excuse me. So there's another one here. It's kind of long. Avoidant restrictive food intake disorder.
Mhm.
And that's when someone has certain foods that, or they restrict themselves, or they completely avoid these certain food groups. And this is way more common than we might think, especially in young kids these days. It's more than just, I don't like broccoli.
Mm.
It's, I can't eat it. This can range from really mild to severe, and some people might only eat a few foods because they have a fear of choking on something. They don't like the texture. They don't trust the ingredients. There can be a list of psychological reasons, and it can lead to major nutrition deficiencies, weight
Mm.
loss. It can lead to
Mm.
impaired growth. This needs to be treated, and it's a
Yeah.
psychological disorder.
Yeah. That actually sort of leads us to the whole idea of treating disorders, really, doesn't it? I mean, we've sort of given some of the effects, the short-term effects, the long-term effects. We've talked about the different types. We've emphasized the link between trauma, particularly early trauma, and eating disorders. So how do you feel about moving on and talking about treatments and, being
Yeah.
able to move beyond these limitations?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is something that a lot of people are going to need help with, especially those who just found out that what they've been dealing with their food disorders is actually a disorder and not just some random thing that they're going through themselves.
Yeah, yeah. And ultimately, it's about getting professional help, because once you enter this world of eating disorders, it's not something that as an individual you can overcome on your own. And it's something we've emphasized quite a lot throughout our episodes, that with trauma and the effects of trauma, we can individually do things for ourselves and develop coping mechanisms and tools. But ultimately, something as serious as this really does need medical intervention.
Yes, absolutely. There's a really great facility out here in Colorado. If any of the locals listening to the podcast are interested and they need the information, reach out to me. I'd be happy to provide you with the information for the clinic.
Mm, mm. Well, it was really interesting when I was doing the research on this topic. One of the key elements of recovery and treatment is going in and under those deep layers and finding out, well, what was the trauma that originally triggered this, and dealing with those emotions that are related to that original trauma. So it's important for any sort of further treatment to help with the physiological aspects for that initial trauma related triggering to actually be treated. And one of the things that I looked at was dialectical behaviour therapy, DBT. And that is actually something that challenges the black and white thinking that occurs in people with eating disorders. So the focus there is on mindfulness and developing mindfulness strategies, regulating emotions, and becoming more effective interpersonally. So developing those social skills that are really important, that people who have eating disorders, it has impacted on their social connections.
Yes.
And also the last thing in terms of DBT is um, the tolerance to distress and how to deal with distressing situations. So, it links in again with the mindfulness and the emotional regulation. So those four key elements are really important ways of moving forward for treatment of any kind of eating disorder. And often they do it through group therapy, where people, discuss how and why things have actually happened, and can go through those different types of treatments there. And some really interesting stuff that I also found out about is experiential therapies like art therapy and animal therapy are really positive ways of dealing with eating disorders, because they allow the expression and the release of emotions in a sort of soothing environment. And so, again, going back to the DBT, it's mindful, it's helping with emotional regulation, and it's helping with distress tolerance. So those are really fantastic ways of working with people with eating disorders. And sort of once that underbelly of trauma and its associated emotional responses has been treated, then the actual treating of the eating disorder can begin. So,
Yes, absolutely. There's so much involved with eating disorders in general that I think a lot of people aren't really educated on.
no, no.
Yeah. When you see somebody who is obviously too thin, don't automatically assume that they have anorexia. They may have other medical issues.
Yes.
My friend Mark, who had pancreatic cancer, his body wouldn't digest food and he ate all the time. He was not anorexic, but a lot of people thought he had become anorexic. He was fighting cancer. And when you see somebody who is obviously anorexic, don't just shout at them, eat a cheeseburger. That's not helpful.
No, because associated with that is low self-esteem, low self-worth. And if you've got people saying, do this, do that, well, that just emphasizes their feelings, negative feelings about themselves, and sends them down that spiral again.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Eating disorders are also associated with body image disturbances. So
yes.
a very thin person can look in the mirror and see themselves looking or feeling like a whale. I'm huge. I'm ugly. I have no sense of self-worth. I need to starve myself until I feel better about myself. And of course, all that's going to do is make you feel worse. So when someone has a distorted view of their body, they believe that they're overweight, or they might see themselves as painfully thin and they might eat to be able to gain weight. And I've known other people who are survivors of severe trauma who overeat, not because it's a compulsive issue, but because they purposefully want to make themselves less attractive so the same abuse won't happen again. And that gets dangerous too. That is a sense of control like none other.
Well, that takes us right back to the beginning of the episode, really, doesn't it? Because during that traumatic event, there was absolutely no control whatsoever. Right. And so now, through that controlled eating, that is the way that individuals can actually get that sense of empowerment, that there is some control in their life. They can regulate something. And even though it's killing them or really hurting them, they still have that sense of control. Yeah.
Absolutely.
So is there anything else that you want to add before we wrap up? We're getting close to the end of our episode.
Just wanted to remind people that asking for help, especially if you've got an eating disorder, if you've had trauma, is not a weakness. That's why it's so hard to do. So take a moment, take a deep breath, remember who you are, remember where you are, remember you've been through some stuff, and it's okay to ask for help.
Yeah, I can't emphasize that either any more than that. It's so important. So, well, thank you, Amanda. This has been a really tough subject to talk about today. And for anyone who has been triggered by this episode, please reach out either to us or to a support person.
Absolutely. And thank you, Chrysanthi, for always being your amazing self. I love you to pieces.
Right back at you, kiddo. All right. We'll see you in a couple of weeks' time.
We'll see you
Bye
then.
for now.
You can find out more about Growth from Darkness through the website www.growthfromdarkness.com. You can also learn more through the Facebook page, which can be found at facebook.com/growth from darkness. Thank you.